Hey Wolfpack, and welcome back. I hope you all had a great week. Today, we're doing 3 more Cannibal encounters. Have you had any recent spooky encounters? Comment them down below. I'm curious to read them. With that said, whether you're sitting around a campfire, on the night shift, or even laying in bed, let my voice soothe your nightmares. Okay, my name is James Howing. I'm a cannibal, but I never asked to be. Let me start over. I come from a high upper class family. Every member of my family has been in the medical field, going all the way back to the 1900s, from doctor to combat medic to surgeon, even fireman sometimes. My great-great-great-grandfather made a deal with the supernatural entity to heal others better than anyone. But in exchange, we have to consume another to pay the price. It is some messed up shit. But now, that gift is passed on to any person born into the family. So, adopted kids don't get the gift, or anyone that joins by marriage either. My father, Dr. Richard Howing, is a trauma surgeon. He has saved many lives over the years, but he has never once mentioned this. He said that it was a family tradition to learn about the gift on the 18th birthday, not before, so that anyone who did not want the gifts were given to the entity. I have no reason not to say yes. This is just wrong, and I can't. The gift is powerful, and I have my suspicions about the entity. I believe that it is making us consume lives to make itself live longer, to add to its lifespan. I don't want to kill others, but I don't want to die. God, please, I don't want this gift, not now. Things are going well for me. I've just graduated. I've got caring friends. I can't believe this is my life now. I volunteer at a children's hospital. A kid was choking and I dislodged the food stuck in his throat. My father said that saving anyone counted, from anything. I go out tomorrow to find someone to claim for the entity. It's over the weekend and in the slums of Oklahoma City. I've brought back someone. The good person my dad says that he will be treated to the best time of his life. Then, I'm supposed to kill him while he sleeps and consume his heart. This is so messed up. I can hear him in the upstairs portion of the house. He sounds so happy. I don't want to go through with it, but I can't help but wonder what it feels like to sacrifice a soul. I did it. I killed a man. I'm washing my hands right now in the washroom. They're trembling like crazy, though. My dad says it's time to perform the consumption, and I feel sick to my stomach. The whole family's here, watching me in their Sunday best. I feel nervous, but satisfied. My whole family pats me on the back and congratulates me like it's nothing. This feels so wrong, and yet so right at the same time. The heart is bigger than I thought it would be. It's kinda squishy as well, and somewhat wet. Dad says that I picked a good person, and that I still have to eat the heart while it's still wet with blood. I don't want to go through with it, but holding the heart in my hand, I just can't help but wonder what it tastes like. My mother made steak that night. Everyone enjoyed it, and requested to have it as a later date as well, and my father and I have talked it over. I start medical school in the fall, but I have done some research. The entity goes to Atasha. That's a pretty name. I can't wait to learn more about this gift. I have so much work to do. My investigation into the morbid death of my father had last led me to the killer, although he was considerably a changed man. This change had occurred shortly just before he was released from prison. During the last few months of his 25-year sentence, he had created a new persona for himself, this one called Pickard, and subsequently absolved himself of his crime. I have destroyed the fiend I once was, and will inherit neither his vices nor his sins. was what he had told the prison officials in the release board. Well, a year after his release, I managed to uncover the location of the hamlet to which he had exiled himself. Tucked away in the Alaskan wilds, I had barely known my father, being an infant at the time of his death, and my mother never spoke much about him, probably to avoid the resurrection of the grief which had assuredly plagued her. Guiltily, my curiosity regarding his murder met, and sometimes exceeded, the resentment I felt for the sick man. I knew very little about either men, and since starting research, I had come to slightly know more about the murderer than the victim. The former was a European immigrant, worked for some facility during electrical maintenance, was 48 at the time of the murder, and lived alone in a neighborhood not far from ours. As you can see, it's not much, but I could only give you the same surface-level information pertaining to my dad. I flew to the destination in a chartered plane, after of course notifying the local authorities of my visit. I didn't necessarily doubt that the man's claims to psychiatric or spiritual rebirth. It seems a common occurrence among inmates with egregious crimes, but wanted to ensure my safety regardless. I did, however, come unannounced, hoping that my impromptu visit would catch him off guard and allow for more honest answers to my questions, if he would have been otherwise resilient. I had many, with the most important simply being, why? He had never disclosed his reason for abducting my father, and according to those who had worked with him, he hadn't before expressed anything resembling murderous desires. Certainly nothing cannibalistic. To my surprise, he welcomed me warmly, and invited me into his humble dwelling. There was little furnishing, and what was there seemed to be only for practical use. I saw no pictures, vases, plant life, or anything which would suggest that it was someone's home, rather than some temporary lodging. It was a very austere environment, and I suspected it to be a psychological remnant relating to the bare conditions of prison cells. I was showed to a small room, which I discerned to be a study, judging by the various posters showing scientific formula, and the many stacks of books whose titles bespoke of topics such as wiring and circuitry, physics and radiation. The man had been an electrician in his former life, so I wasn't too surprised by the scene, although I couldn't imagine him keeping up with the work in any meaningful capacity at his age. We sat in two enjoyably cozy armchairs, and after a brief introduction, he was not surprised by my identity, and even admitted to anticipating my eventual arrival. I was given immediate permission to ask my questions. I first asked of Clark, the man who had knocked my father unconscious outside his garage, piled him into a van, and eventually killed and ate him. To this, Pickard responded, "I cannot speak on his despicable crimes. I can only thank the state for having mercy on the body I now inhabit." Before I could address this, he spoke again, saying, "Now, what I can tell you about are his friends." I was taken aback by this. I hadn't heard of the maniac having anything resembling friends. I knew only of his mannequins. My records recount them as being numbered, but not named, whom he had dressed with parts of my father's body. He continued, "Yes, his friends were remarkable people. They supported him, kept him on the path of good." He did not seem to notice my visible confusion at his consideration of goodness, and encouraged him to achieve his dreams, no matter the cost. Yes, very good people indeed. Seeing as how this was brand new information, and could lead to a better understanding of his doubtlessly warped mind, I encouraged him to describe these people who had apparently been so influential to his mental predecessor. He seemed delighted to, and spoke again. "Well, there was Yakub, quite a character. He was as strong as a demon, that one, and had a sensible mind on the topic of women. Let's see, who's next? Ah, Logan, the army boy. Or was it the Navy? It doesn't matter. Logan was a good man. although he had a terrible temper after a few drinks, and could be a bit simple in the head at times, but nonetheless a good lad. Here he pauses, gestures towards a dark corner of the room. I at first thought it to be some eccentricity brought on by his derangement, but a figure emerged from the shadows and approached us carrying a steel tray which held 2 coffee mugs. This person, who had apparently been standing silently in the darkness, was a bald and intimidatingly tall man, clad in a black silk robe. He did not speak, and something about his movements suggested that nonverbal communication was the norm for him. Pickard took a mug from the tray, and the man leaned over, withdrew a knife from the folds of his robe, and made a small incision in his own wrist. He then allowed the blood to trickle into the outheld cup. Pickard sipped from the mug, nodded in approval, then waved the attendant towards me. I respectfully declined the beverage, barely managing to conceal my disgust. Without acknowledging the extreme strangeness of the moment, he went on. "And who could forget Agdane? An eccentric fellow for sure. I recall him professing his love for a man named Sean. The exact title eludes me, but I do hope he and Agdane are happy. That Agdane was a kind man, and shared a similar view of the world to Clark. Moving on, we arrive at Dennis, a man of many names, but a face you'd recognize behind any disguise. Endlessly persecuted by that despicable institution of our morality. What was it called? The IRS? But Dennis always came back. Better than ever. He was a very funny man. I would miss him, were he a friend of mine." Here he coughs, and his attendant, who had receded back to the shadows, came forward again and produced a handkerchief from his robe, which Pickard took and coughed into. I saw, before it was crumpled into the servant's hand and put away, black droplets of mucus-like discharge on the cloth. He resumes. "And last, for I fear I'm growing hungry and do not like to eat in the company of strangers, I will tell you of Ethan, or Eck, as he called him. Another kind man, but he never could escape the employment of the service industry. Died in a kitchen fire. Very tragic. He and Clark had played cards together, going at it for hours. Yes, a very close companion. I do recall. Well, that's all I have time to share. You'll be escorted to the guest room by my associate, where you may spend the night, if you would like. You've arrived fairly late in the day, although it may not seem like it. Night will be here shortly. And as you are obviously aware, I live quite far away from anything which could call itself a town. The vehicle you presumably rented will be perfectly safe where you parked it. I do hope I have been of some help to you. I admit that I haven't been very forthcoming with information about myself since my release, and that not many of Clark's former associates remain alive. Hopefully, you'll be able to understand that man's mind better than I can." I was led out of the same room by his mute servitor, who seemed to either not mind the wound in his wrist, or not possess the mental capacity to understand the sensation of pain. Later, as my plane flew over the region in which the cottage had been built, I would see this man's performing the same self-bloodletting to feed a dog in the backyard. A dog I hadn't seen, nor heard during my stay. I agreed with the man's observation, and decided to spend the night in his home. I had nonchalantly informed Pickard that the authorities were aware of my location, and that my colleagues were as well. They had advised me to not come. So, I doubted he would act on any malicious plans. I doubted he even had any. And while the servant was physically imposing, he didn't seem very bright, and I doubted that he would be instructed to do me harm. Pickard himself appeared extremely weak even for his age, and had moved with a sluggishness that suggested one, if not many, underlying health problems. The guest room was similar in its bareness to the rest of the home, although it had been granted the apparent privilege of a mirror, something I hadn't seen in any other rooms. Through a doorway within, I was told in a shout from Pickard, was the guest bathroom. I set my bag down on a firm bed, blanketed by a sheet of thick gray wool. The general layout of the room was similar to the study, albeit lacking the various scientific instruments and tombs. The servant bowed and left me to my privacy, closing the door as he departed. There was a simple wooden desk, under which a chair had been tucked. I opened my bag, retrieved my surveillance equipment, and sat down at the desk. I brought a small digital camera with an adhesive mount and built-in microphone. Nothing fancy, just something which could record for long periods of time in decent quality. It had a 64 gigabit memory card, which was more than enough space for what I needed. While I suspected that Clark Pickard had indeed slipped into some sort of dissociative state, or had simply succumbed to early senility, I did want to be certain that he wasn't doing nefarious things when unwatched. I mounted the camera in the corner of the room, just above the bed, aimed so the rest of the room was visible. The microphone, as I had tested earlier before arriving, was fairly sensitive, and would pick up faint sounds regardless of from where they originated within the small house. I adjusted the placement of a vacant shelf so as to conceal the camera from view when entering the room, then entered the adjoining bathroom to wash up and prepare for sleep. I slept soundly, which I felt guilty about later, being able to get rest under the roof and hospitality of my father's murderer, but I told myself it was necessary, that I couldn't be faulted for managing a night of pleasant rest while trying to discover the reason why my father was chosen for the despicable act. I awoke fairly early, around 6 a.m., and had planned on checking the recording, but Pickard's servant knocked just as I got out of bed. I composed myself and opened the door, and the towering man silently motioned towards the direction of the kitchen. I held out my hand in a gesture of waiting, to which he nodded understandingly, and then I went to the bathroom to relieve myself. Once I finished, I returned and followed him into the kitchen. I sat at a circular wooden table while the servant prepared coffee. He did so in full view of me, almost theatrically, as if to assuage any fears I may have regarding the composition of the drink. His wrist, from what I could see, had not stiffened at all from the wound he'd given himself the night before. As the coffee brewed, I heard the sounds of creaking floorboards and things being moved about in one of the rooms. The servant left the kitchen, and then returned, assisting Pickard in walking. The old man sat down, greeting me groggily, then motioned at his servant, who brought him several pills in tiny paper cups. Coffee was served, and we drank in silence. The servant did not drink anything, but stood silent and immobile off to the side. Once medicated and fully awakened by caffeine, Pickard asked how I had slept. "Just fine," I told him, and then offered me some cereal. He told me that he didn't eat meat, that he couldn't stand the stuff, and I didn't comment on whether or not this had anything to do with a certain one of his past meals. I accepted the cereal, being surprisingly hungry. They were off-brand flakes, unsweetened. I finished breakfast, asked one last time if there was any information that he could remember worth sharing about Clark. There was nothing. Then went back to the guest room to prepare for my departure. Once bathed and bundled, I thanked him for his hospitality, and in an astonishing moment of warmth, he lightly gripped me by the hand, looked into my eyes, and apologized sincerely for what happened to my father. Despite his obvious mental instability, I felt sincere contrition in his words during that moment, and found myself tearing up. I left the house and entered the truck I had borrowed from a shop owner in the nearest town. Pickard and his mute servant stood in the doorway as I started the car, waving me off. I drove away, my brain and heart unsure of what to think and how to feel about my visit. I arrived in town about 45 minutes later and called the pilot whose small plane I had chartered. He told me that he would pick me up in an hour, so I went to a diner to have a proper breakfast, unsatisfied by my bland cereal. I ordered a steak and some scrambled eggs, and another cup of coffee. I unpacked the equipment from my bag, intending to review the footage I had recorded during the night. For the first few hours, nothing occurred, and the only observation worth relating is that, apparently, I snore in deep sleep. But, at 3:23 a.m., the door of the guest room quietly opens, and a figure enters into the room. They stealthily creep over to the bed and perch themselves atop the headboard. The camera, for whatever reason, did not have night vision capabilities, but I had left a lamp from the desk turned on, and yet the person was not illuminated by the light. It was as if they were wrapped in shadows, which dispelled the light's touch. They stared down at me for exactly 11 minutes. Then, at some unseen impromptu, they began chanting in a deep, concerting voice, whilst holding their hands above the bed. I slept on, oblivious to what was happening. Later in that day, as if the footage were digitally manipulated, the figure is no longer visible. In this altered state, the video is worthless, but I've extracted the audio, which remained uncompromised. While the intruder was unidentifiable, due to the aforementioned clinging shadows, his presence was still clearly discernible. How he was removed from the recording is something I've yet to figure out. The audio, which I have not altered or distorted in any way, is here. I warn you, the recording is, at least to me, very unsettling, and may not be something you wish others to hear. The words spoken are not in a language I'm familiar with, and the voice itself is rather hideous. Once the figure finished its dark oration, it slowly dismounted the headboard and crawled upon me. Somehow, my sleeping self hadn't heard or felt any of this. I felt sick watching the footage, but continued on. The intruder's head hovered above my midsection and remained there for several minutes. Then, once finished with its strange activity, it crawled off the bed and left the room, never making a sound of movement. The night passed without further incident. I shut off the footage and sat in silence. The waitress arrived with my food, but the sight of it turned my stomach, and I almost fled to the bathroom. I drank some coffee, but it only served to further excite my already unstable nerves. I knew what I had to do next, and dreaded what I might see. After taking several deep breaths, I raised my shirt and examined the spot where the intruder's attention had been focused. I expected to find any manner of a wound, or at least a preternaturally healed scar of one, but found nothing like that. There was only a small spot of discoloration, which was not nearly as worrying as the things I feared. Just then, the pilot called and said he was ready. I packed up my things, begrudgingly ate several mouthfuls of eggs, then paid my bill and left. As I mentioned earlier, we flew over that cottage on our way back, and I saw that titan of a man draining blood from his wrist directly into the mouth of a hound. Again, he seemed perfectly at ease while doing so, and the dog seemed perfectly fine with the manner of feeding. I still have so many questions, but after watching that video, I think it's best to do as my mother had done and cease acknowledging the existence of that man. Whenever feasible, one should always try to eat the rude. Dr. Hannibal Lecter. After an hour or so of the usual questions, I was caught off guard. Why don't you say what you've really been thinking? Trying to hide my surprise, I admire Mr. Tomlin's candor and his keen sense of observation. It was true. I didn't give a damn about this interview, and I was going to be leaving the network shortly, after anyway for a better job. I was on the eve of my 40th birthday. I had 2 mortgages and canceled dinner plans. Instead, spending the night interviewing a serial killer. Maybe that's your dream, but I can tell you with the utmost certainty, it wasn't mine. What do you mean, Mr. Tomlin? A twinkle came and went from his eyes. I mean, why don't you stop wasting both of our time and ask the important question? I've only got a few hours left to live, you know. I met his gaze, and for a moment, he struck me as a taller, thinner version of Hannibal Lecter. Was I afraid, you ask? Sure, as afraid as anyone can be when confronted with such evil. But there was also a very thick plate of what looked like glass between us, and 2 strong enough guards stationed at opposite corners of the room. Still, I was tired of pretending. He was right about that at least. Okay, you win. I motioned for the cameraman to take a break outside the room, and I pulled my chair closer. His face was maybe 4 feet away from mine at this point, and even though there was a barrier between us, we were able to hear each other perfectly. Making no attempt to play nice anymore, I put my cards on the table, so to speak. So, what kind of sick person eats people anyway? I paused for a moment before continuing. I mean, that's what you wanted me to ask you, right? Are you happy now? Yes, Mr. Tomlin said. Yes, I am happy now. He grinned wildly, and I saw that his teeth were a kind of perfect white that resembled the purest ivory. They looked sharper than they should be. Or was it my imagination? Well, since you asked, I'd be glad to answer. It's not exactly something you could see yourself doing, is it, Mark? Eating people? No. Can't say there's any situation where I would find myself eating a guy. What about a girl? He asked quickly, making no attempt to hold his laughter. Before I could express my disgust for him, he continued. I'm going to share a little secret with you, Marky boy. Oh yeah? I said sarcastically, humoring him by leaning in closer. Yes, he said more seriously. What if I told you that before this interview is over, that you're going to develop the taste, just like I did? Did you just say, the taste? And then, Mr. Tomlin winked a single time, and my vision went black. In fact, everything went black. When I finally came to, I ran to the door. My eyes were still mostly failing, and I could only make out slivers of shadows around me. I slammed my hands against the steel frame. Let me out! Let me out! I screamed, feeling more terrified than I had ever remembered, and not sure completely why. After a moment, the door did indeed open, and my vision began to return enough to see the horrified look on my cameraman's face as he spoke. Jesus Christ, Mark. What the hell happened? His voice stopped as he looked from my eyes down to my shirt and hands, and as chance would have it, that's when my vision returned fully. My chest, arms, and hands were almost completely covered in blood. Oh God. Oh God. I said aloud. The world started to spin faster and faster around me. The 2 guards' bodies were stacked, one atop of the other, directly in front of the glass where I had last spoke to Mr. Tomlin. The old man was standing perfectly still, never having escaped from his side of the room. A wide grin froze over his face that stretched ear to ear. Mr. Tomlin never said a word, instead, only making one small act. He sat back down in his chair, cocked his head to the side, and nodded. I blacked out completely then, but my insanity continued even into the darkness, and I swore that I could even hear him whisper to me, even in my dreams. That was 2 years ago now, and I'm approaching the eve of my 42nd birthday. Things are a bit different, you could say. Instead of mortgages and dinner plates to worry about, I don't have much stress at all anymore. In fact, I spend almost all my time reading. They've allowed me a small garden to tend to. The one condition of my plea deal. Exceptions aren't usually made for people such as myself. So, I guess I should consider myself lucky. Life is a little bit simpler now. Some nights, I find myself sitting in silence and thinking of Mr. Tomlin. Long dead, but still, somehow, all the more alive in the darkness of my mind. But that's not what you really want to know, is it? You want to know if I still have the taste. Well, due to the circumstances of my conviction, while unlikely, it is still possible that I be brought before a parole board at some point. Maybe I'll even get out of this place one day. I guess you'll have to just keep wondering. Thanks for listening, Wolfpack. If you want to submit your own story, the links for my email and subreddit will be down below. I've also created a Discord, so if you want to join that, the link will be in the description down below as well. don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And with that said, have beautiful nightmares, and I will see you next time.